welcome back to the channel. So I've been thinking, and I've been trying to come up with some creative video ideas that no one has ever done before. And by golly, I think I've got it this week. I've got a bag that's a camera bag full of gear. And I thought, how interesting would it be to set it out all over the table and show you what I've got in there, and maybe even call it something creative and mysterious like what's in my bag. So time to get excited. I went on safari earlier this year in February, and I did take a bunch of gear, and actually I really did watch a bunch of what's in my bag videos from a bunch of photographers, and I found them so helpful because I really didn't know what to expect. So really, this is my attempt to give back to those of you who might be on safari at some point, and you may be wondering what gear you should bring and what gear you should leave. But before I get into all of that, let me help you understand the context for my dilemma. So I went to South Africa for 9 days, and I had a pretty varied itinerary. I was with a group. We were moving quickly from place to place. Some of the trip was touring the countryside and the landscape and towns, but a big portion of the trip was spent in tent camps that were right outside of Kruger National Park, which is this enormous wildlife refuge the size of New Jersey, where all of the lions and cheetahs and just the wildlife out in the savanna, the bush of South Africa live. We were going to be in safari vehicles for some of the time, driving right up to animals. There may have also been animals way off in the distance. I didn't really know what I was going to see or when I was going to see it, and I had to kind of make sure that I was prepared. I also wasn't even sure, like in terms of focal lengths, which lenses to bring, and that was just half of the battle. The other side of my dilemma was that I had a weight restrictions on the domestic flights within South Africa. So the international flight had some restrictions about what could be a carry-on and what had to be checked, but also the smaller domestic flights within South Africa had pretty strict limits about bag weights. My carry-on bag was limited to 15 pounds. And so, of course, I want to carry my camera gear with me on the plane. I'm absolutely not going to check a bag full of all of my expensive gear. So I had to make sure that whatever I selected was within 15 pounds. And that is easier said than done. Another aspect of the difficulty for my decision making was that in South Africa, they have rolling blackouts called load shedding that are going on right now, and they're getting more and more intense by the day. And basically what this means practically for me is that for several hours during the day and several hours at night, there are these planned periods of time where there's just no electricity where we'd be staying, which meant I might not be able to charge my camera. We might not have air conditioning, a lot of different considerations throughout the day and the night. Well, with all of that context in mind, the first decision that I needed to make was on my camera. So what camera would I bring? And of course, I'm going to bring my baby boy, Nikon Z9, and this is the camera that I went with. At the time, the Z8 had not been released, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but the Z9 is an absolute workhorse. The battery lasts all day. The autofocus is on par with the best, and I wasn't going to go without this camera. The only hesitation I had was it is heavy, and remember I had that 15-pound weight restriction. So if I would have been able to trade this for a Z8, it would have been pretty tempting for the weight, aspect of things, but no complaints, no regrets. I'm so happy I had this with me. But I didn't just bring one camera. I know I was trying to cut down on the weight, but it was a non-negotiable for me that I had a second body. And this is actually the camera I am recording this video on, and it is the Z6 II. Now, had the Z8 been out, I may have considered that for my second body, and really if I had an unlimited budget, I may have just brought 2 Z8s. That would have been ideal in terms of weight and capabilities. But what I had with me was the Z9 and the Z6 II, and here is why I was insistent on having 2 camera bodies. Number one, I wanted to be prepared for any situation. I read and I heard from others that had been on this trip that the animals in the park saw safari jeeps and trucks as just animals in the savannah. They didn't see you as an individual in the truck. They just saw the safari vehicles and they were used to them being around. And we did find this to be true when we were there, by the way. We just rolled up and parked right next to several animals. We were near lions, we were near hyena, and even a leopard at some point that was in the tree right, and we were right below it. And they didn't seem to be bothered by us too much. So I wanted to have a short lens so that I could quickly take some photos up close if I needed to. But also we were in this wide open savanna, and I wanted to be able to capture birds and capture things that were off in the distance. And what I didn't want to be doing in the dusty African savanna is taking my lens off and putting a new lens on every time the situation changed. I would have missed so many shots that way. So if you are going, I highly, highly, highly recommend you bring two bodies, one for shorter to mid-range distance and the other for mid to super telephoto distances. And so that's what I did. I do not regret it. I recommend highly that you do the same. In terms of the Z9, just to go back to that for just a second, some other things that I really liked about having this body, it has the dust cover and the Z6 II does not. This really came in handy because Africa is very dusty. And again, the Z8 also has this. So if you're bringing two Z8s, a Z9, a Z8, if you're a millionaire and you've got two Z9s, dust cover, super helpful. Also, the high megapixel sensor was amazing for cropping. So 45 megapixels cropped into 20, and you've still got a full frame image that you could put in a book or print on the wall. And so that really helped me to capture some lions, for example, that were way off in the distance and some birds. So I'll put a photo on so you can see what I mean. In terms of the cameras, that is my recommendation, and I think I was pretty happy with what I did. Next, though, I want to talk about my lens choices. Now, this was tough for me because, again, I was limited in weight, and also, in hindsight, some new lenses have come out that would have made my options a little bit better. But I'm going to tell you what I did pick, and then I'm going to tell you if I were going again this week, what I would bring instead. So what I did for my super telephoto was I brought my 500 PF. This is my favorite lens. The quality is incredible. And for a 500 millimeter lens, this is a really lightweight and easy to transport lens. I was in several situations where there were small birds. There were some rollers, some shrikes, some bee eaters. Also lions off in the distance. The 500 millimeter came in handy. And I really remember ahead of time questioning whether or not I would even need that focal length. Yes, I did. If you're questioning it, yes, you do. Bring the longest lens you've got. You find that it comes in handy, especially if you like birds. But again, we did have some mammals that were closer. So for example, elephants, giraffes, and the 500 was just too much. So in those situations, I switched over to the 300 millimeter PF. So same deal. It's a prime, excellent quality, f4. But this is a second lens, and I did find myself switching lenses, which was a problem. And so for the longer range stuff, I don't regret bringing these lenses, but if I had to do it again, I would either bring the 100 to 400, or Nikon has just released that 180 to 600 lens. Absolutely, I would bring that lens instead. That is a one-stop shop, and I've got everything all the way back from 180 to 600, and I can crop the lens and get effectively over about a 900 millimeter lens. No brainer. Bring the 180 to 600 if you have that lens, and just combine everything into one. So amazing choice, and I highly recommend it. And I'm going to pick one up for my next trip, I think. On the short end, though, I brought this 24 to 120. This is a phenomenal lens. To get as wide as 24 for landscapes and all the way up to 120 for some wildlife and maybe closer up mammals or large mammals like elephants, was incredible. So for the most part, I had the 500 on one camera, my Z9, and I had this 24 to 120 on the Z6 II. And just being able to grab each camera and switch back and forth was remarkable. It was very convenient, and this lens is sharp. It's an f4. I highly recommend it. Just bring this lens, and then you don't have to worry about switching and getting dust all over your sensor. Okay, now for some honorable mentions, I did also bring this 14 to 30 f4 lens. I was thinking maybe I might do some astro. There might be some landscapes. And I did take a few shots with this, but if I had to next time sacrifice a lens, I would say this one would probably be the one that I, sacrificed, and I'd just stick with the 24 to 120. Also, when walking around town, I didn't want to be carrying around a big expensive lens, and I know there's sometimes pickpocketing and crime in some of the towns in South Africa. So I opted to just bring this cheap 40 millimeter f2 for my everyday kind of street photography lens. And I love this lens. It's definitely a character lens. It's not as sharp as, say, the 50 millimeter 1.8, but it's a great lens. I love the images that it produces. It's light. It just throw it in the bag. It hardly adds any weight. So if I had to choose to bring an everyday street lens with me again, I would choose this one again. It's a wonderful lens and I like it. Okay, so we've talked about cameras and we've talked about lenses, and I also brought with me a bunch of tools to help keep those cameras clean. I mentioned this already, but South Africa is pretty dusty, and I know that is universally what I heard about other places like Botswana and elsewhere in Africa as well. So especially without having those dust covers on all of my sensors, I wanted a way every single night to keep the sensors clean. So the first thing I recommend, same thing that every YouTuber that has a photography channel has ever recommended, and for a good reason, it's one of these rocket blowers. I'll put a link in the description if you would like to check one of these out, but this thing will blow the dust right off your sensor with a few little bursts. It does take up quite a bit of space, but I do think it is lightweight and worth it. For the more difficult to remove dust, though, I have these full frame sensor cleaning swabs, and both my cameras are full frame, so compatible with both, and some sensor cleaning fluid. Every single night, I would just make sure that there was no dust on the sensor, because I didn't want all of my fabulous photos from the other side of Earth to be covered in dusty spots. Also, for the lenses themselves, some microfiber cloths. Just remember to always kind of blow off the sand and the dust first before you wipe it with a microfiber cloth, because you don't want to scratch your front element. But outside of that, I needed a way to power my equipment. Remember, there is load shedding happening in South Africa, which means several hours in the day and several hours at night, you're not going to have the ability to charge your devices, even if you have a power conversion brick, one of those travel adapters. You just won't. There's no electricity. So I highly recommend packing some extra batteries. I have some for the Z6 II and for the Z9. And what I found is the Z9 is pretty good for an entire day for me. And especially if I've got a second body that I'm shooting with, it's more than enough. So if I can get one of my batteries charging while I'm using the other one, I typically found that was quite enough with that camera, but you might want to bring 2 or 3 of each just so that you've got plenty, especially if you're a heavy shooter. I also recommend potentially, if you've got space and weight, bringing some battery packs. This one's a lightweight one by Anker, so that you can charge over USB-C potentially when load shedding is happening. Another pocket of gear that I brought that I thought was just so helpful was data management. So both the Z9 and the Z6 II take CF Express Type B cards. So I just brought as many of those as I could. I picked up some 128 gigabyte cards. I had 2 for my Z9. I had 1 for my Z6 II, and I had a backup. Also, since the Z6 II takes SD cards, I threw a few into those as a backup as well. But what I found to be the most useful was actually picking up a few of these SanDisk portable solid state drives. This one's 2 terabytes. You get 2 or 3 of these, throw them in your bag. You can not only back up 6 terabytes worth of photos if you really need to, but if you have less than 2 terabytes worth of photos, you can actually make redundant copies and put them in different places. Maybe one in your pocket, one in your bag, one in your suitcase. So if one gets lost or damaged, you don't lose all of your photos. Another thing that I brought that I thought was just so helpful was this tiny little cable, and I'll put a link to it in the description. So I don't know if you can see this, but on one side we've got USB Type A, and on the other side we've got Lightning. And then you can actually take the lids off or the caps off of both, and you've got double USB-C. So you can adapt any of those together. And I found this useful for charging, but also for data transfer. So here's what I did. I've got this CF Express reader, and it goes into USB Type-C. And on this end, what I did was, rather than bringing my MacBook or anything like that, I brought my iPad Pro. So I would take my iPad Pro, which I've got here, and adapt it to the CF Express reader, transfer my photos from the memory card to the iPad, then pop off the reader and pop on the SSD, if I can do it. And then once you've got that attached, you can actually copy the images to one or multiple SSDs. I found this way to be the simplest with the fastest transfer speeds, and I didn't want to overcomplicate my process by bringing extra USB-C hubs or anything like that. Okay, so for the last topic, I want to talk a little bit about things that I brought that if I went again today, I would not bring again. And hopefully this will save you a little bit of weight and trouble. So the first one, and this may come as a surprise to some of you, is a tripod. I brought this carbon fiber tripod that I had carefully selected, thinking I might do some astrophotography or I might mount my camera and look for some wildlife. I would say unless you know for a fact that you're going to do astrophotography or landscapes or really need the tripod, you can probably do without it. It was too bumpy to use in the safari jeeps. I couldn't really go outside at night in the tent camps because there were, predators around and it wasn't always safe. I would have rather just, put the tripod away at home and saved myself the trouble and the space. The second one is a little controversial, but it's binoculars. Everything I read and every video I saw recommended bringing a pair of binoculars, and I did. And it could just be that my binoculars aren't that great. I never reached for it. There were actually other people who used my binoculars, but I didn't. I'm so comfortable looking through my telephoto lens that I just looked for everything through my telephoto lens. And especially if I had that 180 to 600 lens, I could just be sitting in the Jeep, zooming around. I didn't really feel the need for the binoculars. So they just took up weight and space that I personally could have, left here at home. Now, I know some people will swear by binoculars, and if you are one of those people, I'm sorry if I offended you. Please take some binoculars. But for me, I didn't really need them. So I left those out of the bag. Oh, and I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about really quickly the bag itself that I landed on and which one I did take and which one I didn't take. Now, originally, my plan was to take the Shimoda Explorer version 2. There are a million reviews about this bag on YouTube, and it's great. I use it all the time here. It's a wonderful bag. And one of the reasons I was strongly considering it is because inside of the bag, there is this core unit that you can buy either a small one, a large one. You can customize the size. You can buy multiple ones. And then if for some reason they ask me to check my bag because the airline or the plane ran out of space, I wasn't about to leave my gear, anywhere except for with me. And the Shimoda bags come with these carry cases. So if I needed to, I could take out the core unit, put it into this bag, and carry it with me as my carry-on on the plane and not worry about missing out on my gear. So that was my original plan, but I was over that 15-pound weight and I just couldn't make it work. So I ended up going with a backup bag. And the one I went with was this Low Pro Fast Pack BP 250, the Low Pro Fast Pack BP 250. I don't know what it is about this bag, but I always find myself reaching for it. It's got this bottom compartment that has a kind of a tiny core unit for putting your lenses in, and it's got this big spacious top compartment. I found it was useful for the plane. I could fit all of my gear and lenses in it. It was smaller, it was lighter, and I just ended up going with this just to play it safe. But if you do end up going with the Shimoda Explorer version 2 bag, it is mostly safe for international flights and domestic flights in, I think, Europe and the United States. I just wasn't sure about Africa, so I just decided to play it safe. But anyways, so that's it. That is the gear I brought, the gear I would bring next time, and some of the gear I wouldn't bring next time. And so I hope you found that helpful. If you've already been on safari and you've got other ideas or suggestions or tips, leave a comment below. I'd love to see them. Also, if you've got thoughts about my gear and my setup and some suggestions to potentially improve it for next time, please leave that in the comments too. If you are planning to go on safari and you have some questions, or you have questions about what South Africa is like, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer. And last but not least, thanks everybody. I'm getting so close to 1,000 subscribers and I'm so excited that you all are tuning in and leaving really good comments and are just so engaged with the channel. I can't thank you enough. If you are liking this content, please feel free to hit the like button so YouTube sends it to more people. If you've got somebody that you know is interested in cameras or gear or bird photography, etc., send them my way. I'd love a few more subscribers so I can get to that 1,000. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again next week with another one-of-a-kind original, never done before YouTube video idea. Take care.